Hello, friends. Welcome back to Unfeigned Christianity, where we seek to find culturally aware, biblically nuanced, and Jesus embodying responses to current day issues. Today on the podcast, I have Sheila Wray Gregoire as a guest. She wrote the book, The Great Sex Rescue. Some of you may or may not be familiar with it, but I'm honored to have her on and discuss what is sex, what is healthy sex within marriage, and specifically this book is really kind of a work of tearing down some false ideas about sex that have been taught within Christian literature about sex and marriage and how it's harmed marriages. And so I look forward to sharing this interview with you. We discuss at the very end, we discuss a little bit of how do you create a healthy sexual relationship within marriage from the ground up. If you're new, if you're starting out and or maybe you've kind of come to a head and you're dealing with some sex addiction and you're married, and how do you work through that in a healthy way? Because one of the negative pieces that have come through a lot of Christian books on sex is that the way you help men stay free from porn is by giving them sex, right? Sex within marriage. And that's actually, not only is it not helpful to the man's struggle, but it's dangerous for the wife and for the marriage as a union. And so we get into some discussion about how do you pave a healthy way forward. At the end, that's for patrons. If you would like to become a member, you can go to asherwhitmer.com/member or click the link below, and you can access that expanded portion as well as all expanded versions of our podcast episodes. But other than that, we dive into some false conceptions about sex within marriage and how should we think about sex and so forth. The rest of the interview is for the taking. And without any further ado, here's my conversation with Sheila Wray Gregoire. Yes, it's good to have Sheila Wray Gregoire on the podcast today. Did I get your last name correct? Okay.
That actually wasn't bad. That wasn't bad. Gregoire, yeah.
About it. But it's good to have you on the podcast. For those that are familiar, Sheila's the author of The Great Sex Rescue. If you're watching the video version, I'm holding up the book here. If you're not familiar with Sheila, she's written a lot on largely to women. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
There is a book for guys.
You and your husband have done
women.
some work together, sex, marriage. Your podcast or your blog is the Bare Marriage podcast. Is that correct? And
yes.
Kind of in just a second, I want Sheila to kind of share some of her background and give some context. But just for my audience, just to explain kind of how I stumbled on, and just for some context here, Sheila and I just hopped on here, so we're still kind of getting to know each other as well. So some of this will maybe create some context for Sheila. But I grew up in a world kind of immersed in love and respect. And I always want to be careful how I talk about love and respect, because I know couples that have experienced a major turnaround through the book, Love and Respect, and kind of through some of that approach to marriage counseling and so forth. And so I know that there's been some good that has come from it, but there were pieces that I kind of began like kind of being puzzled by some of what I was observing in that world, that I started doing a deep dive in it. I had gone through the series, my wife and I had gone through it several times, and I've read the book once, and I decided to do a deep dive again and just like, is this healthy? What is this? Yeah. Why do I see some of the things that I was seeing? And the primary thing was a focus on submission as opposed to, a focus on respect and kind of, female submission, respect to men. And in that process is when I stumbled upon you. You had just started, I don't know if it was your first kind of rebuttal or evaluation of love and respect, but I think it was when you had initially reached out to focus on the family, perhaps, about it and so forth. And so that's kind of how I became familiar with your work. And I started probably listening to your podcast or watching some YouTube videos, and then read some blog posts, and eventually got the book, The Great Sex Rescue. And it sat on my shelf for a while until I finally read it here in December, January. I kind of forget when it was. And I would just, my plug for the book is I would say this is probably the best book that I've read on marriage and sex. I haven't read a ton. I've maybe read 3 other books. So whatever that's saying, but just, I would love to hear, we can get into love and respect and some of that in a bit, but just for some context, what is your background? What do you do? Who are you? What brought you into this conversation?
Sure. Right. Well, I grew up in the evangelical church, just like you did. I have a couple of postgraduate degrees, sociology, family studies, public health, and I was public administration, and my husband's a physician. So I was home with the kids. I was privileged to be able to stay home with the kids because he made enough money that I could do that. But while I was home, I started writing just for something to do. I wrote magazine articles, small books. In 2008, I started blogging because everybody was blogging then. So I got in that mommy blog group, and the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. So I never intended to become a sex blog, but I became a sex blog. No one thinks to themselves, I want to grow up and be the Christian sex lady. Like, that's just weird, right? But I did. And so between 2012 and 2019, I was writing a lot on sex. I wrote some big books on sex. But the one thing that I didn't do was I didn't read other books. I had this real fear of plagiarizing. And I had this idea that, well, they love Jesus, I love Jesus, we must all be saying the same thing. And so my husband and I, we spoke at a bunch of marriage conferences. I'd hold up Love and Respect, and I would recommend it. Like, because I figured, hey, we're all saying similar things. But what I kept finding was that even though I was writing these good books about sex, like they were good books, I was writing good blog posts, people were still having the same issues. And it was a Friday afternoon, January of 2019, so 4 years ago now. I was procrastinating, I had a headache, I didn't want to work, and I was on Twitter, and people were fighting over whether they needed respect or love. And primarily women were saying that they needed respect. And I thought, I have that book, but I've never read it. So this is a great way to procrastinate. So I went and got the book, and I opened to the sex chapter because I'm the sex person, right? And it's only about 12 pages long, so it wasn't too long a read. And as I read it, I call it like the nuclear bomb going off in my living room, because I read things like, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have. And the need is for physical release. Nothing about intimacy, just physical release. If he doesn't get physical release, he'll come under satanic attack. Most affairs are caused by men not getting physical release, and you need to minister to him sexually as unto Jesus Christ. There was not a single word in that chapter about a woman feeling pleasure too. There was just obligation and guilt and threats. And I thought, oh my goodness. If this is the main message we're giving about sex, no wonder people are still having the same issues. And so our team, and I had working for me at the time, epidemiologist, statistician who had just had a baby. So she was just working part-time from home. My daughter was working for me, and she's a psychometrics grad. And, we tried to reach out to focus on the family to tell them about the problems with the book. They didn't listen to us. So we decided that we would do the largest research project that's ever been done on evangelical women. Oh, wow. We surveyed 20,000, and we asked about marital satisfaction and sexual satisfaction. And then we gave a bunch of different beliefs that are common in the evangelical church so that we could see if there are, or we could compare people who did believe something with people who didn't believe something to see if it affected marital and sexual satisfaction. And we were able to identify which beliefs that are commonly taught in our best-selling books actually.
And that survey is kind of what created this book then? Yeah, that's fascinating.
That's
so
right.
What were some of the issues that people kept having? I'm trying to think which angle to take here, but maybe we'll start there. Like, what were some of the issues that you kept noticing people bumping into?
Well, okay. Whenever you hear sex talks, like if a pastor gives a sex talk, if you read a marriage book about sex, what is the primary issue that they're trying to solve? Like, what do you think?
have more sex?
Exactly. It's how to get people to
Yeah,
have more
yeah.
sex, because the underlying idea is that women don't want it. And so we have to get women to have more sex. And so the problems that I kept seeing were women have no libido and aren't really having a very good time. And so we're like,
Mm.
okay, what is the issue? Why do women have no libido? Is it biological? We wanted to check that out. So we did a ton of research. We looked at all the peer reviewed research on female sexuality,
Hmm.
specifically in long-term committed
Yeah.
relationships. And
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
we got to the
interesting.
bottom of a lot of
That
this
that
through our
was one
survey
of
too.
probably my
Mhm.
biggest surprise in marriage. There's obviously a lot of surprises, things we don't know or anticipate. But one was I didn't think my wife would want sex as much as I did. And if anything, she wanted it more, at least for a moment. Like
Yeah.
obviously having children and busy schedules and everything kind of
Yes.
affects people differently. But that was a surprise for me. What are some of the beliefs that you've discovered that cause low libido or just a general anxiety over sex?
Hmm. We identified six really negative beliefs in our survey, and we deal with four of them in the Great Sex Rescue. We deal with another two in our book that's
Okay.
coming out in April for moms of teen girls. But there were four big ones that really affected married women. And I think there's like, if in Lord of the Rings analogy, like how there's one ring to rule them all. Like I think the one ring here that rules
Mm.
all of them is this idea that sex is for men. You know, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have. And we read this again and again in books, how men need sex and women need hugging and kissing and connection and affection and talking. And it's dichotomized like that. Like women need the emotional and men need the physical. And this is what we're told over and over again.
Mm.
And the harmful beliefs tend to stem from that. So in terms of like which ones lower libido, one of the ones that we found had a really big effect on libido is
Hmm.
all
Hmm.
men struggle with lust. It's every man's battle. Right. This has been taught huge in the evangelical world, that all men, because men are visually stimulated, because they have this innate need to consume women's bodies visually, all men are going to struggle with lust. And when women believe that, when women are even taught it, like this was one belief that we found affected women, even if they never actually believed it, they were just taught it. Even if they're taught it as teenagers, before they even met the man they're going to marry, it lowers their
Hmm.
libido and it lowers their trust in their husbands later. Because the idea that all men struggle with lust is, it makes sex into something threatening. It makes your body something which is constantly under
Hmm.
threat. And that's not a comfortable thing to have. And even if you don't believe it, if you're being taught it, it means you're surrounded by people who believe it. And it creates a very strange interpersonal dynamic, especially between boys and girls, where girls are often
Hmm.
blamed for the way that guys
Hmm.
treat them because he can't help it because he's a guy. And anything that makes sex feel icky or seem like she's going
Yeah.
to be under threat
Yeah.
is going
That
to
makes
lower a
sense.
woman's libido.
You in your book, the beginning of the book, the first thing you address is like what is sex and how we've created a
Mm-hmm.
misconception, particularly like we think of sex as the act of intercourse specifically. And I really liked how you kind of fleshed that
Yeah.
out. How would you define sex, and how would you talk about sex so that it's not icky?
Yeah. Well, okay, we do. Like if a pastor is going to talk about, for instance, how God gave us the gift of sex and we need to be celebrating sex, you know what
Mm-hmm.
they mean is that we need to have more intercourse in marriage. And this is what when you ask someone, you know, what is sex, they do tend to define it by intercourse. The problem with defining it that way is that she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head. You know, she could be in emotional turmoil or she could even be in
Mm-hmm.
physical pain and it would still count as having sex.
Mm-hmm.
And how is any of that a gift for her? And so what I'm trying to challenge people to do is to go back and see what God actually said about sex. And if you look at one of the first times that God specifically talks about sex is Genesis 4 verse 1. Adam knew his wife Eve and they conceived a son. And it sounds really funny. It sounds like God is embarrassed of saying the real word. And so he's using a euphemism, but I don't think that's what's going on at all. Because if you look at the Hebrew root there for the word to know, it's the same root of
Mm-hmm.
when David says, "Search me and know me, O God." You know my inmost heart. It's this deep longing to be connected. And I think God is telling us that sex is not just physical, it's a deeply intimate thing. So, sex is intimate. It's not just a physical act. We know from Song of Solomon that sex is really pleasurable for both of them. Like she actually speaks more words than he does in that book. So she's having a good time. So it's pleasurable for both. And we know from 1 Corinthians 7, verses which have been completely misused over the years, but if you look at them in context and properly, we see a picture of something which is completely mutual. He wants it, she wants it. They both have everything the same. And there's more to it, but that's how I often define it. Like if we think of sex as something which is mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both. And that means that a lot of people are having intercourse and they're not necessarily having biblical sex at all.
Friends, I wanted to tell you about a resource that we have currently available beginning here in the month of May 2023. And that is a guided study on creating sexually healthy romance. That is something that members of Unfeigned Christianity can get for the higher level tier. It's like a course, although it's kind of the first run through of a course. So I'm calling it a guided study. But if you're looking to pursue a relationship, if you're in the middle of a relationship, maybe you've been married for a number of years already and you just desire to grow deeper in intimacy and love with your spouse, then this course will be helpful for you. Not only do we have some things we'll be working through, workbooks that we're going through, but I also have some exclusive interviews with a variety of people. Lori Krieg, her and her husband published the book An Impossible Marriage. I'm going to be interviewing her as well as some other folks as we look at a conversation of what does it look like to create sexually healthy romance. Obviously, first dealing with our own personal issues, and then what does it look like in a dating relationship? And then how do we live healthy as a couple? If you're interested in that, just click the link below for creating sexually healthy romance, or you can just visit www.asherwhitmer.com/member, and you'll see the different tiers of membership and the one that is devoted for this study. I hope you're able to join us. I look forward to it. And it'll be running for about 5 weeks here in the month of May. And then obviously, as long as you maintain your membership, you can always access it in the future as well. For our audience, we had a slight mix-up in the schedule, and so we jumped on here last minute, and hopefully it doesn't feel too scattered here. But so there's two things that I'm thinking about. One is to dive into a little bit more of the pain, the piece that causes pain, because I think in my world, I don't think men are aware of the physical pain that women can endure sometimes in sex. Very rarely does a man have pain with sex. And so without education, that can kind of fly over our heads. But then the other aspect is, what all does biblical sex entail? And maybe the two are kind of married, but you can answer either one of those questions, whichever one you want to dive into here.
Yeah, well, let me start with the pain because then we can get back to the other one because it actually does fit. So one of the things that has been known in the gynecology literature for like 50 or 60 years is that religiously conservative women experience sexual pain at about twice the rate of the general population. What hasn't been known is why. There's been a lot of things speculated, but they haven't known why. And so one of the things we wanted to get to the bottom of is why. Like, what is it about being religiously conservative? And we actually presented on this at the American Physiotherapy Convention last year, and we're writing a paper on it. So this is really exciting because we were able to get to the bottom of it. But basically, there is a sexual dysfunction disorder called vaginismus. And it happens when the muscles of the vaginal wall contract and become really tight. And it's completely involuntary. No one's trying to do it, but the muscles can't be relaxed. And it makes penetration really painful, if not impossible. And we found an incidence rate of about 22.6% of women have experienced this, 7% to the extent that penetration was impossible. And this is huge. Like, that's really common. If you think about how we all know the words erectile dysfunction, like everybody knows what that means. But in couples under the age of 40, vaginismus is so much more common. And we just don't talk about it in the church. And yet this is primarily our problem. So we wanted to know, like, what is it that's causing this? And the one big belief that we found that was heavily implicated in vaginismus was the idea a woman is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. When women believed that, their chances of experiencing vaginismus increased to almost the same statistical effect as if they had been abused. Yeah, because both abuse and obligation say to a woman, you don't matter. He has the right to use you however he wants.
Yeah.
And women's bodies experience that as trauma. And and it's really seriously scary. And so, in terms of a biblical idea of sex, this is what we need to understand. 18% of our respondents said that their primary feeling after intercourse was feeling used. So it wasn't feeling closer. It wasn't, feeling loved. It was feeling used. And that isn't biblical. The idea that couples just need to have sex more and then God is pleased with you because God has ordained that couples must have sex in marriage, that's actually a really dangerous idea. Because as soon as we create obligation around sex, we make it ugly. What God has ordained is that we have mutual, intimate, pleasurable sex. And so if she's feeling used, it is not intimate. And she is actually already being deprived. We often use the do not deprive verses to mean if you don't have sex, you are depriving someone. But if you are using someone for intercourse and they are feeling used or they are feeling in pain or they never receive any pleasure, so they are being deprived.
To reiterate, you're referencing 1 Corinthians 7 there where it says, don't deprive each other. You're saying that Paul is not saying don't deprive each other of intercourse. Paul is saying don't deprive each other of the whole intimacy experience, pleasurable experience. And if either one, but specifically in this conversation, the women, if she's feeling pain or if she's not feeling that pleasure, then she's being deprived.
Well, imagine telling a woman that the way that your husband feels loved is to use your body in a way that causes you pain.
Yeah.
And yet that is what we have done.
Yeah. One thing I really appreciate about your book is you recognized that, I forget what chapter, it was kind of towards the end, because there was a little period where I was arguing with you a little bit in my head because I was like, well, I'm not that way. I know other men who aren't that way, but you guys end up addressing, I thought in a very healthy way, how a lot of men aren't necessarily maliciously trying to use their wife. They're just this message has been immersed on the ladies that we happen to marry or whatever, or maybe a little we're just ignorant of the different dynamics that may affect how a lady's sexual arousal happens or whatever. What would you say to men, whether they're young, married or not, but they do, they care about their wives, they're not wanting to use them? How do you go about kind of figuring out where your wife is at? Because the one story that you talk about is where I think they were married for 30 years and she was experiencing this thing and he had never known that. And it just appalled him to think that she thought this.
Yeah.
I forget if it was obligation about sex or whatever. Yeah. What would you say? How do men pursue?
Yeah. Well, I think what guys need to understand is that a lot of women are not getting these messages from their husbands. They're getting these messages from the women's Bible studies they've gone to, from the books they've read. Right? Women read way more marriage books than men do. And when women go to women's Bible studies, they study, our best-selling books, which often contain these messages. And so women have heard this stuff and a lot of husbands don't know. And we did a number of focus groups after our survey. And we talked to women specifically who had experienced pain, who had experienced the obligation, belief, but had come out on the other side of it. And so many of them told us it was not my husband who made me feel guilty. It was not my husband who made me feel obligated. It was almost like I felt like it was God, because I had these voices in me saying, you need to have sex every 3 days, or he's going to look at porn, or he's going to have an affair, or you're not going to be a good wife. And that 72-hour rule is really common. Yeah. It's in Every Man's Battle, Power of a Praying Wife, sheet music. It's throughout our literature. You need to have sex every 48 to 72 hours, or he will watch porn or have an affair. It's even where women are even told you need to give him, I don't know how explicit I can be on this podcast, but you need to give other sexual favors during your period or in the postpartum phase. And that needs to be your obligation. And yet the guys hadn't ever felt this. And so when we heard story after story of where husbands learned that was what my wife was feeling. And one particular story stands out to me. So they had actually had a really good sex life. She'd been really orgasmic. Things had been going really well, but they'd had 4 kids. And with each child, sex got more difficult for her. And after the 4th one, she'd had really bad postpartum depression. It had taken her a while to come out of that. And once she did, she went back to initiating sex every 72 hours, like she felt like she was supposed to. And this went on for, 2-3 years, whatever. And then she came to her husband and said, I can't keep doing this, because she never got back her enjoyment of sex. And he said, well, I don't understand. I don't ever want you to do something you don't want to do. Like, we need to take this off the table. Like, from now on, do not initiate if you don't want it. If I suggest it and you don't want it, say no. If we're in the middle of something and you change your mind, say no. And we will stop and I will be fine. And he proved that to her over the next few months. If she stopped in the middle and said, no, I changed my mind, he was okay with it. And all of a sudden her desire came back and her sexual response came back. Because it wasn't an obligation, it was a choice. And that makes all the difference in the world. And so that's what I would say to guys is, your wife could be experiencing this, and it could be just because of the stuff she read, or it could be a combination of like your ignorance and bad teaching plus the stuff she read, or whatever it is. But if you can give her space to say no, then you allow the desire to build so that she may actually want to say yes.
Yeah, you talked about that as well, like how the fear might be that, well, if you let women have a say in whether or not they have it, then maybe you wouldn't end up having any sex. And not only, there's some other logical issues with that, but you talked about how that actually created desire and created.
Exactly.
Hey friends, this podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Dwell app. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Dwell audio Bible app, but this app is phenomenal. It's changed my life in several different ways. As a Bible college student, I do tremendous amounts of Bible reading throughout the semester, more than I normally do. And I'm not a fast reader. And so one of the ways that I have been able to keep on top of the Bible reading is through the Dwell app. One of the things I really like about it is there's very meditative, reflective music played in the background of the reader. So it's not dramatized. Some audio Bible apps are dramatized, and that's a little, I don't know, not my cup of tea. But it's a very calming and just peaceful way of having the Bible read to you. There's at least 15, I think there's close to 30 by now, different voices that you can choose from. There's many different translations you can choose from. For the ESV, I think there's maybe 2 or 3 voices, if that makes sense. But there's over 15 voices for sure. And so you can have a female voice, you can have a male voice, you can have a British accent, you can have an American accent, you can have a Canadian accent, or well, I like the British accent, so I listen to the Bible in the British accent, and it's been a really good way to keep on top of my homework. But also, I have found sometimes I'll be listening to audio Bible as I commute someplace, or as I'm doing some other work, or even in the morning. Sometimes it's hard to wake up, you're tired, and to sit down and read, it literally feels like an intellectual exercise. It's like school, like starting your day with school. And I love learning things, but I don't do well at starting my day with school. And so when you wake up and you're tired, but you want to meditate on the Word of God, to just put in my AirPods and listen to the Dwell app is an incredible way to start my morning, just in peaceful worship, meditation. I hear things differently. when I hear it being read than when I read it. I personally think you should read and hear it both, but that's one thing I like about audio Bible is different things stick out that didn't stand out before. I'll listen to it as I'm going on a run or something, and I can't say enough good about the Dwell app. And so if you would like to take your meditation, your Bible reading to another level, you can also, if you're not able to sleep at night, you can put in your AirPods and listen to the scripture being read and fall asleep that way. I've used that at times as well. But you can start for free. There's a link in the description below, or you can go ahead and purchase the annual plan, which I have, and to me it's very much worth it, just in the way, a couple things, the way it helps me meditate and kind of a fresh view, a fresh experience with scripture, and then also the way it helps me keep on top of my homework. It's been very helpful for me. I'd like to dive into some books, Love and Respect, but let's first discuss kind of this piece. You've alluded to it a little bit. It's sort of probably somewhat engine behind the obligation a little bit, but this idea that wives are supposed to be the methadone, or like the thing that keeps men have this biological need, and if they don't have it met, then they're going to go find it somewhere else. Where does that come from, and what is the truth about that?
Yeah. It is so widespread. It is so widespread in our books. Every Man's Battle, literally said your wife can be a merciful vial of methadone when you feel your temperature is rising. And it talks about how when you're quitting porn and lust, what you're supposed to do is take all of your sexual energy and transfer it onto your wife. So while you used to be going to her for 5 bowls of sexual gratification a week, through ejaculation of some sort, now you come to her for 10 bowls. And then inexplicably, they say this will make her happy, which
and that's kind of out of an assumption that all they want is intercourse as well. Or why would they think it may? Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, like it's just crazy. But yeah, it is this idea that you need to use your wife whenever you feel the pull to something else, so that she can satiate you, so that you no longer feel the pull to the thing you really want. So she is like a drug to numb you, and you use your wife as a sin management tool. And we see this certainly throughout the Every Man's Battle books. They're definitely the worst of our bestsellers for it. But it's also in sheet music. They talk about how a woman who had been married for 10 years realized that giving her husband manual stimulation during her period would help him to get through this really difficult time, because her period is a difficult time for her husband. I mean, any guy, stand up in a mixed group and say, my wife's period is a difficult time for me, and see what kind of reaction you get from the women. Like, no, honey, her period is a difficult time for her. But this is the attitude that's coming out in so many of our books. And when we see sex as merely about physical release, and when we see porn as being about physical release, because, you masturbate to porn, then it's easy to see them as substitutes for one another. But the thing is that porn and sex are not substitutes for one another. They're polar opposites. Because porn is about using something or someone in an image for your sexual gratification, and sex is supposed to be an intimate knowing of someone where you are serving one another. If you think that sex is a substitute for porn, then you're seeing sex as using someone for your sexual gratification, and you're missing the entire point. And I think a lot of our evangelical resources have missed the entire point
and
of
even
what sex is.
That concept of the period being a difficult time for the man exposes, I don't know if this is just in the Christian world or kind of an American or Western culture, that life is all about sex, and it's not all about sex.
And I want everyone to understand too, like, I'm a very sex positive person. Okay. Like I've created libido courses, orgasm courses, like most of my books have been about sex. But what we know is that as soon as you make sex into something which is merely about his orgasm and merely about him using his wife, we miss the boat. We wreck it for both people. And we have since surveyed men for our book, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex. And we found that the messages that hurt women hurt men just as much. And so we need to stop this and get back to a much more holistic, intimate view of sex. Because right now we have made it almost entirely about him using her, and her experience is secondary. I mean, her experience is so unimportant that Love and Respect doesn't even mention the fact that women can feel pleasure. In fact, in one podcast of Emerson Eggerich's that I listened to, he said, you can't tell if a woman is aroused, which
you said, what podcast was that on?
Anyway.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
One of his, he said that. Yeah.
I mean, I know that to be experientially untrue.
Whatever. Okay.
But,
no, like it says a lot.
Let's dive into the books a little bit more. Although people who follow me on Facebook, I shared this quote on Facebook, but I really appreciated what you said on page 90, the concept. I'll just read it here. Maybe the fact that women feel so upset by this every man struggles with lust message isn't because women simply need to understand men better. Maybe it's because women are being asked to accept something that reflects the kingdom of darkness rather than Christ. And I like that quote really hit me, is just like how we have framed solving man's issues with lust and pornography. Like the way the Christian world has tried to solve that and cope with that has actually been to adapt the nature of darkness and the beast rather than the lamb, in the way Jesus, or the way the kingdom of God would have us interact with each other and as couples.
Well, and we read that, like, again, I'm picking on the Every Man's Battle series, but many other books, other bestsellers do this as well. But they literally say that men just don't naturally have that Christian view of sex. And that when it comes to sexual sin, men get there naturally simply by being male. And I do not believe that women have more access to the Holy Spirit than men. I do not believe that men were made less in the image of God than women. And I think that is such an incredibly low view of men. Yeah. And it traps men in an endless cycle of shame. And that's what we've done to so many guys. And we've basically equated male sexuality with the objectification of women.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. And it's not that men can't be more. I think we have taught men that they need to channel all of their emotional needs and all of their needs for intimacy into sex, because we haven't given a lot of men the tools they need to emotionally connect in any other way. And so sex becomes a shortcut for connection, and sex becomes a shortcut for them to feel like they're connected to their wives without actually having to do the work of connecting. So you have sex with your wife, you feel like you're connected now, but in 18% of marriages, she feels used.
Yeah.
Because we haven't dealt with the root issue. Which really is intimacy. Let's work on intimacy. Men are just as capable of intimacy as women are. Men need intimacy just as much as women do. But in our culture, we have taught men that you're not allowed to be vulnerable. And so they often cover up pain with porn,
so
with
are
sex,
you saying
with other things.
I'm asking this a little rhetorically. Are you saying a man should pursue intimacy as a way of getting his sex?
I think that sex is the culmination of the intimacy that you experience in marriage. That is what it's supposed to be. It is the physical culmination of the intimacy that is there. And when there is no intimacy there, this is what we have teased out as well. Okay. People who have high marital satisfaction, where both people feel heard in arguments, where both people feel like their opinions matter, they tend to have much better sex lives. And people who have better sex lives, yes, they tend to have better marriages, but a sex life alone cannot create a good marriage. You really do need that intimate underpinning first. And often guys think, and women can think this too, it's just more common among men because of the way we've socialized men. There's nothing innate about men that does this. There's nothing that means men are not capable of intimacy. But often men can feel, as long as I'm having sex, our marriage is good. And that is not necessarily true at all.
What you mentioned earlier, in that men are channeling their desire for connection into sex. And I think that's something that is, in general, maybe just in Western culture. But yeah, the idea that men are emotional beings as well, and they just need connection sometimes too. Like sometimes they don't even need
Mhm.
sex. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But again, not to say that sex is bad. Sex is awesome. Like, and couples who have great sex and have great marriages, like they're awesome. And that's what we want for everybody. But we're
yeah,
not going to get there by emphasizing the wrong thing. You can only get to great sex through the roots of good marital satisfaction, of really valuing
yeah.
each other and of treating each other as teammates, as partners. And so, and what our books have done is they've tried to tell us
Hmm.
that we can get
Hmm.
to good sex and
Yeah,
great sex just
yeah,
simply by having it a lot.
yeah. Well, maybe
And that's just not
I'd
true.
like to end maybe giving, if you don't mind sharing, like the 5 top things you would tell your younger self, or like a new couple or something. Like, how do you develop a healthy sex life? But before we get there, so just to be entirely blunt and honest here, like the critiques that you have in your book of other books, I know, like in my world, there's a lot of people who would recommend a lot of those books and who have found help from those books.
Mhm.
How do you, and I, it may have been something of yours actually. I shared on my Facebook page critiquing, kind of, you guys had a video where you walked through a message from Dr. Egrich, and you were kind of evaluating that, and I shared that. I thought it was really good. Just kind of exemplified some of the ways. A lot of it is almost what he doesn't say that is dangerous, is what he says. And
Mhm.
I got mixed feedback. Some was really positive, but I also got some very harsh, critical feedback criticizing Egerich. And so I'd be curious, how do you process that, or how should people process when there when there's a book that has seemed to help a lot of people? Then obviously, like,
Mhm.
I know, and some of the people commented on that thread, how Love and Respect has done damage in their marriage. Yeah, what do you say to people, or how do you guys process that? Do you reject the whole book, or is, like, what is my question clear, or is it?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Let me just give some
Yeah.
facts first, and then we'll get into how you make that argument. And I'll use Love and Respect as an example, but this applies to pretty much any book. So part of our project was we created a 12-point rubric of healthy sexuality. So we evaluated books on 12 different aspects, and so the maximum you could score was 48. The lowest you could score was 0. The book The Gift of Sex by Cliff and Joyce Penner scored 47 out of 48. Really good
Just a
book.
quick comment
Love
on
and
that. I
Respect
have The
scored
Gift of
0.
Sex, but it's a really boring cover. I've never read it yet. And then after hearing that in your book, I was like, oh, I should go read that one.
Yeah. And so, it's not like every book is the same. There are some books that are better than Boundaries in Marriage scored 42 out of 48. So when people say my 2 favorite marriage books are Boundaries in
Interesting.
Marriage and Love and Respect, I laugh because they're polar opposites. They do not say the same thing. But again, I think we have this idea that because something is Christian, they must all be saying the same thing, and they're not. So just looking at things objectively and applying a rubric, books score very differently. And I think it's important to look at which one scored well. Also, in our survey of 20,000, we never named a single book. And we left an open-ended question. Are there any books or ministries or anything that's hurt
Interesting.
your marriage? And Love and Respect
Mhm.
was the number one mentioned thing that harmed marriages. So I just want to say it is harmful. But here's what I would say to people who say, but the book helped me. Books, most marriage books say one major overarching thing. Almost every marriage book will say this. You need to prioritize your marriage and you treat each other well. Okay? That's a good message. Treat each other well. And Love and Respect does say that. And when people are helped, it's usually because people are reading a book because they want their marriage to get better, first of all. So even the wanting your marriage to get
Mhm.
better means it probably is going to get better, right? And the book they happened to pick up was Love and Respect. Had they picked up a different book, it probably would have helped them as well. It's just they happened to pick up Love and Respect. And They really liked the pieces about, treating each other well, and they did that and it worked. If we're trying to figure out if a book is harmful, we need to look not just at the things that it says that every other book also says, but at the unique things that it says. Like, what makes this book unique? And we need to judge it not just on everything it says, but on the unique things that it says. And the unique thing that Emerson Eggert says in Love and Respect is that women must give unconditional respect, which includes sex on demand, even if he is drinking and straying. That's on page 88. Even if he has uncontrollable rage so much that you want to get away and hide. I think that's page 288. Even if he has been physically abusive and thrown a plate at your face and been in jail, you just need to give him unconditional respect, including sex on demand, letting him make the decisions, understanding that you are easily deceived as a woman, and so you must listen to his insight, not yours. These are the things which make the book
and just to clarify,
and those are the
does
things
he
that are
say
harmful.
that directly, or is it in the story that he gives and she learned how to give him sex, but communicated in the story is that he was throwing plates or whatever?
Yeah, so the plate story is earlier in the book, but the theme of the book is that you must give unconditional respect no matter what. In the withering rage, so much so that she wants to get away and hide, that's specifically about unconditional respect. And he defines respect throughout the book in the chairs analogy, right? Conquest, hierarchy, authority, insight, relationship, and sex. So you need to let him make the decisions. You need to give him, you need to never speak up. The only way that you're allowed to speak up, according to the appendix, is to say 2 to 3 sentences every 10 to 20 days. And other than that, you must be silent.
Yeah.
It's just highly problematic for any woman who is in a remotely destructive relationship, or it just tells women you are not allowed to speak up, because to say anything that you don't like or that you want changed is disrespectful.
Yeah.
And that's not healthy. That's just not healthy. And it certainly doesn't promote intimacy, because the only way to have intimacy is if both of you matter. You cannot truly know each other if one person is told that you are not allowed to speak up with what you think.
One of the things, the main thing that I started evaluating with Love and Respect, I'm in the middle of Bible college right now. And so I was more evaluating his usage of Ephesians 5. And so then it was interesting to hear your perspective from the angle of the more practical, how it's affecting women's bodies and then their marriages as well. But the Ephesians 5, the emphasis is on men being respectable, really. Is more like you love her, you care for her so that she can respect you. I think be a better rendering than just the wife. I forget how it says the wife should see to it that she respects her husband or something.
Yes. Yeah, I agree that he makes a huge deal out of the fact that respect has to be unconditional. But if you look at the actual verse that he uses as a cornerstone for his book, in the Greek, condition is implied. I agree. And it's better, in order that.
What about one book that was interesting? You had a negative view was, I don't have it on hand real quick here, but Intended for Pleasure. That book, my wife and I would have said before reading your book, and that book is kind of different than your book, because what we found really helpful was just the incredible practicality of it going into marriage. And there was a lot that we were just kind of ignorant of. And so that gave us some insight and some tools. But I would have said that was probably the best sex book that I had read. And largely because I got from it this message that I need to be really in tune to her pleasure. But you had some negative things that came out of the book. Talk about some of those things that were.
Yeah, and it was really good for that. And remember that this was a book that was written
80s or 70s.
in the 80s. And so
Okay.
Yeah, I think, Act of Marriage was 76. I think Intended for Pleasure was 81 maybe, but I could be off on that. But it was very early. So it was one of the first books that was really focused on female pleasure. And it did a good job. In fact, Intended for Pleasure scored in the neutral category on our rubric. It didn't fall in the harmful category, largely because it just didn't talk about 4 of the big things that we measured. So it couldn't score badly on them. It didn't talk about lust, pornography, affairs. It just didn't even touch on them at all. The problem is that it still had a lot of this obligation message. It did say, for instance, that during the postpartum phase, she should be sure to deliver manual stimulation at the same frequency as he had been having release before pregnancy. kind of thing. So, you know, and that's just one little thing, but that again, the emphasis is so off. So she's just pushed out a baby. She's exhausted. She might have postpartum depression. Her milk's coming in. The baby's not sleeping. But the big emphasis that couples need to understand is that he should not have any deprivation of his sexual release.
Yeah.
And we see this over and over again in Christian books, like, you know, this most important time in her life and where she is the most exhausted and vulnerable. And the key thing that they both are supposed to be worrying about is how often he receives sexual release. It's very problematic. But that's not the only thing. I can't remember the scoring on that one exactly, but it was also very, very, you can't have a good sex life unless she radically submits and unless he works outside the home and she stays at the home.
Yeah, I'd have to read it. I only read it once and it was right before marriage. And there was a lot of kind of new stuff in there that I was kind of absorbing more than maybe some of the more meta-narrative things kind of coming through. Well, thanks, Sheila, for giving us this hour and conversing about this. I definitely recommend the book, The Great Sex Rescue, and any of other. You have the Good Girls Guide and the Good Guys Guide to Great Sex. Is that what you wrote with your husband?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the Great Sex Rescue is really for people who need to tear down some of the negative messages they've heard, you know, need to pull up that foundation, rebuild it on something healthy. And then the Good Girls Guide to Great Sex and the Good Guys Guide to Great Sex are for couples where you're just starting out and you want to start out healthy and let's build it good from the ground up. And I'm hoping that the more people who get a hold of those books today, who are just getting married, the fewer people will need the Great Sex Rescue in 10 years.
Books, but I saw them and look forward to diving into them sometime as well. So thanks for coming on and giving us this time.
Yeah, thank you.